last year in China, they deployed almost 300 gigawatts of solar. Now, to put that in perspective, in the entire last 68 years of American history, we deployed 186. So China deployed more solar last year than the United States done our entire history. Now, do you think they're doing that because they're big environmentalists or because it's cheap?
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the eMarketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin Lee with the eMarketing Association. I also run Did It, an agency, for most of my week, as well as a bunch of other ventures and an incubator. Super excited to get back chatting with Scott Wharton, who is a fellow Yale School of Management alumnus and is now in the solar business as a manufacturer that sells almost exclusively to utilities. So we'll get a little bit more into that in more detail. But why don't you just start with a quick elevator pitch on Tandem PV and who you sell to, what you sell.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Kevin. We're Tandem PV is a next generation solar panel manufacturer. So we make a full panel, and we're using this completely new material science called the perovskite. Good cocktail party word to throw around there if you know it. And basically, it's this crystal structure that's all around us in the world, but particularly in the last 15 years, it's being used for solar panel technology. And part of why people are so excited about it is that it's 200 times thinner than an existing silicon panel. So it's basically 1/100th the width of a human hair. It uses only about 10% of the energy to make. And we can do all the supply chain here in the United States. So there are no rare earth metals or minerals or mining. We basically make it in the lab here in our factory in California. And you can get better performance out of it. So better, faster, cheaper. You know, what's not to like about it? I mean, the only thing I would say is there's a challenge of while you're getting high performance, how do you make this last for 30 years like the traditional solar panels do? And it's a pretty high bar. I would say we can talk about we're on a path to doing that, but it's kind of the holy grail of solar, and solar is the future of energy, and solar is going to solve climate change. So I'm working in a really fun spot.
Yeah, that's great. So you had mentioned that you in our pre-meeting that you sell primarily to utilities. Does that are those just the big guys, or are there also sort of community solar developers and folks like that sort of may end up doing almost microgrid size deployments?
It could be the smaller ones. I mean, right now we're primarily focused on a category of customers that are called independent power producers. So we wouldn't necessarily sell to like a PG&E or Con Ed. They usually are those bigger entities that provide the power to them. So they're companies that there's one called NextEra. You know, there's a whole bunch of others that most people probably haven't heard of that they do billions or tens of billions of revenue per year. And what they do is they basically buy the solar panels and the batteries and all the distribution of the land, and then they in turn sell the power to utilities or AI data centers, as the case may be. So, you know, probably 90% of the power is done by the top 20 in the US. So we're primarily focused on those. So yes, there are smaller ones, but we're primarily focused on the bigger players.
So given the fact that you're focusing on bigger players, I'd love to talk about how that differentiates your marketing. So obviously, when you can make a list on a few legal pads of almost everybody who's in your industry, and then take the top quartile of that and basically say, okay, these are the only folks that matter, it really changes the market dynamics as far as what your channel looks like from a marketing perspective and from a sales perspective. So I'd love to hear sort of how that dovetails into your communications, your education, where events fit in, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think that, you know, if you're going after 20 companies, then you're really looking at 100 people in the United States that you need to talk to. Maybe a little bit more, but let's say 100. And it means that you can reach out to people directly and have dialogue with them. So I'm going to a big trade show next week in the solar industry, and they have 40,000 people that are only going for solar. So I think most of the people in the industry that we need to talk to, our customers are there. And it really allows you to have a really strong direct marketing and sales effort with a pretty small team. Of course, those people are influenced by a lot of people. So I think PR and podcasts help to kind of have thought leadership, but also I think the idea that you're very focused and you communicate that we only do one thing. So what we're trying to do is communicate, all right, yes, perovskites, but perovskite's just a raw technology like a web browser or IP. Really, our focus is more on AI and utility scale. And people like to know that we're really solving their problems, speak their language, have people on my team that understand what they do. So I think I've had a history of working with either selling to telcos or large enterprises. And there's a lot of value both in having those direct conversations, and also there's a lot of value in knowing that they get influenced by other people. So having PR and podcasts and other things helps where they can say, yes, I saw this company Tandem PV and they're out there in the world, rather than just having a one-to-one conversation. So it's kind of two tracks.
So yeah, you don't often hear folks talk about influencers in a B2B context, especially the super niche B2B. And that's where you're at, right? So have you identified that within industry trade publications or within the broader ecosystem, there are a few people, probably pretty geeky or nerdy people, who are really down into the bowels of engineering, who end up having an outsized influence on people making decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a combination of, there are people at investment banks who write reports. There are a certain amount of industry publications, but there aren't that many that you reach. And, I would say people are also influenced by the mainstream press, although it's harder to get into it. So Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Politico, et cetera. So there's kind of different levels of influence. Probably no different than most industries. You have the industry insiders in the press, and then you have some of the mainstream where people want to see that what you're talking about is not only in this niche, which your insiders see, but even the insiders want to see some credibility from a New York Times or the Washington Post or someone else covering you.
Sure. One of the interesting things we've noticed in our SEO practice at Did It is that, so the digital PR side of things has an influence on the LLM's probabilistic output, right? Meaning that the company is more likely to be mentioned in the context. Of course, everyone asks ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini in a slightly different way, which of course changes it. And even the same query asked at different times will potentially result in a different answer. But it has sort of brought back to the forefront the importance of traditional PR, digital PR, and syndicating content out into not just industry trade publications, but also just thinking about where should a piece of content live that you've created, and sort of what should be created. So as you start to think about your industry and those 20 big buyers, are you sometimes thinking about co-creating content with them that might sit somewhere, might sit on their blog, might sit on your blog, might be on LinkedIn, and sort of including sort of out there in the field, installer-based content, right, where people could really get down into the nitty-gritty?
I mean, it's a good way of thinking about it. I don't generally think that there are customers, and I haven't found this experience, the customers usually don't create their own content, but you can do it with joint influencers. So analysts, investment banks, laboratories that do testing, those are people who tend to have credibility and thought leadership, where you would create more materials with them. We probably would focus more on those individuals than our customers, which tend to want to be, they want to keep their proprietary knowledge proprietary. Probably where I would say they're more interesting is on a social proof method, where you want to go out and say, all right, so-and-so picked us, or so-and-so invested in us. They must know something. I think about it more from a social proof point of view than a content point of view. Probably split it that way.
Yes, that brings me to another follow-up question, which is really the fact that even in these larger organizations where you assume every buying decision is being made purely based on data, in the end, it's trust and relationships that end up being a tiebreaker in many cases between vendor A, B, and C in the final list. So how should marketers think about that on these enterprise level sales engagements where, trust is harder to quantify and harder to gain?
I mean, I have a couple of ways to think about it. One is, I think marketers are always looking for some shortcut. And I can say that as being a fellow marketer and having spent a lot of my career in that area. And then the shortcuts could be, we're gonna have SEO, or we're gonna have email blast, or we're gonna use AI, whatever the shortcut du jour is. And what I found is the one constant that doesn't change in large enterprise selling and marketing is the human connection. And especially in a world where there's so much more noise and disinformation, that the one thing that you can't you can't undervalue is that direct contact. And especially because most people don't pay attention to what's going on in the world. They don't listen. So if you have a one-on-one conversation with someone, it really gives you an opportunity to not only influence them with facts, but also in the gut feel, like, I'm going to make a big decision with someone. Can I trust them? And so that's number one. And I would say is that as much as people want the shortcut, the way I describe it is there's no substitute for hand-to-hand combat. And it is incredibly unscalable, but it works incredibly well. The second thing I'd say is for the marketers out there, if you haven't read Robert Cialdini's book, The Principles of Influence, I think all of those things are particularly powerful around marketing. So there are things like reciprocity and familiarity and scarcity. Those are all principles that I think work well in getting people to trust you and believe in you. And of course, the interesting thing about these principles is that they're universal. You can use them for bad, but I think if you use them in a good intention of just building trust, they're incredibly powerful. And it's one of the books I often talk about with marketers. Even though it's not a marketing book per se, it's about human beings and how do you influence people. And at the end of the day in marketing, I think we're in the influence business, not just showing products.
That's a great point. I'd love to talk about one of the wild cards that exists in many industries, and that is sort of the political and regulatory overlay. And obviously that has come up in the solar category in a couple of different ways. One is the implications of supply chain, but then there's the tariffs implication. Then there's implications of over or under regulating the ability to deploy solar in certain areas based on, is there environmental impact? So there's all these moving pieces that both you and your customers who are buying your panels need to think through and deal with, which creates some instability. Has that changed your, the pipeline, how long people stay in a pipeline? If there's uncertainty as it relates to tariffs, which relates to pricing, which relates to costs of a deployment, does that create a weird dynamic that you have to deal with and that your customers need to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, we're living in a world where there's incredible uncertainty. Some of it self-inflicted, and some of it, particularly true for the clean energy industry. Yeah, I'd say there are a few things going on right there, and just thinking where to start. One is what I found is there's a lot of misinformation out there. And the reason why there's misinformation, it's on all sides, and mainly because people have their agenda that they want to push. So they say things that it may not be true, but maybe they believe it, or maybe they want to be true. So for example, in the government, what you're finding today is I think a lot of people are backed by or captured by the fossil fuel industry. And they just throw out a lot of bullshit that's not true. Like for everybody listening here, no, wind turbines do not cause cancer, for example. And then the other thing, I think that on the advocacy side, I think there are a bunch of people who want to say things like the sky will be falling, we will lose 100 million jobs through these, and they're probably exaggerating too, because they have their own audience to speak to. So I think part of where we've spent our time, and I've spent my time, is just saying, all right, here's where I think it is down the middle. Like, here's what the implications of some of these things are. And just to give you an example, in the solar industry, if you read the popular press, what you will think is that the whole industry is going to be destroyed by the regulation in DC. Now, the reality is the new bill that was just passed by the Republican majority is actually pretty pro-solar manufacturing. So all the tax credits that were in the Inflation Reduction Act that was democratically backed are 100% in the new bill. So now it's bipartisan. And the tax credits for solar developers, the people deploying it, they're cut back a little bit, but they're mostly maintained until 2030. So I bet most of the people listening to us don't know that, because they're listening to just the headlines of, or the sky is falling on both sides. And it's interesting, it's largely not true. And then there's the other thing is I think there are a lot of myths around solar energy. So I just recently did a keynote at our alma mater on the 7 myths of solar. And one of the myths out there is that solar doesn't scale. The reality is more than 90% of all the new energy in the United States and in the world now is being driven by solar and wind. 90%. So that's clearly not true. We deployed 50 gigawatts of solar last year in the United States, just to give people an idea of how big that is. That is about 50 times what the city of San Francisco consumes in a year. So it's a massive amount of power. The other thing I've been focused on is on the AI side. There's a lot of discussion about how we need new energy. And there's a lot of discussion about how, oh, we'll solve it with nuclear or fossil fuels. So a whole part of my presentation is that nuclear is not really available. Like nobody's building new nuclear plants in the US, and you're not going to get it until, if, at best, the late 2030s. And natural gas has a 5-year backlog for 5 years. So even after you build it, we're talking about the early 2030s. Nobody's going to wait for their ChatGPT query for 2030s. And then nobody will finance coal. So literally the only thing you can get if you want to power the AI revolution is solar, wind, batteries. I'm guessing that most of the people listening to this will be like, wow, I didn't know that. But that's true. So if you want to win the AI war, you kind of have to deploy solar. And I think we're seeing that despite all the stuff going on in Washington. I'll stop there, but there's just a ton of misinformation out there in the world that I find myself spending a lot of time trying to dispel.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously AI will use power. Maybe the models will get more efficient and so bring that number down. But the popularity curve is going in the opposite direction. So even if things get more efficient, there's still going to be a need for somewhat reasonably priced power. So from a pricing perspective, if you take subsidies out, obviously you'd probably like to see subsidies removed from the fossil fuel industry to create a level playing field, but those may not happen. When you are able to deploy, and this is not a marketing question, more of just a nerdy question. Obviously, there are transmission losses even with high tension wires. So to the extent that you can deploy solar close to the data centers that will end up doing a lot of the compute, does that really change the equation from the perspective of making it even more appropriate to deploy?
Yeah, I mean, right now this is another myth. So 10 years ago, solar was pretty expensive. It required subsidies to be sold. Today, solar is the cheapest source of energy on the planet. Full stop. Even in some cases without subsidies, it's still cheaper. Although, as you said, all energy sources get subsidies, including oil and gas. But it's cheaper. That's why people are deploying it. In most, give you a couple of stats that are amazing. Last year in China, they deployed almost 300 gigawatts of solar. Now, to put that in perspective, in the entire last 68 years of American history, we deployed 186. So China deployed more solar last year than the United States done our entire history. Now, do you think they're doing that because they're big environmentalists or because it's cheap? I think everybody knows the latter. Pakistan, not known for being an environmental hotbed, people protesting, I've got to have my green power, did 22 gigawatts last year. It's almost half of what the United States deployed. No green movement, no subsidies, just because it's cheaper. So the whole world's kind of moving to solar. I think this is a big positive news story that is not really being reported because there's a lot of, you get a lot of clicks from doing doom and gloom. You don't get a lot of clicks for telling good news. And this is really a great news story for all of us and the climate. We're on a path to solving climate change. Not as fast as we need to, but we are on a path to do it.
Great. So, let's shift gears to sort of the sales cycle and how that has perhaps changed over the years since you guys started. Has it been has it lengthened or shortened based on broader macroeconomic trends or changes in pricing, or how have you had to manage that?
Yeah, I mean, utility scale selling is a very long sales cycle, just like selling to telcos or large enterprises. And it's part of why it's a multi-year process of establishing trust. The path that we're on is we were, when I started with the company a couple of years ago, we were doing lab scale manufacturing. So basically proof of concept, R&D. We just moved into a new factory here in California where we're basically building full-scale products, but not yet full-scale economics. So kind of call it a demonstration plant, pilot plant. Our next factory will be full-scale and high volume. So we're talking about 2028. So what we're working with is in parallel with our customers is sell them the initial commercial products in 26, to get to 28. Now, that sounds like a long time for most sales cycles, but in the energy space, it's actually quite fast.
Yeah, I happen to have a client in the green energy business, so I probably know a little more than usual. But one of the things that exists in a lot of locations is commercial energy is metered in a different way. So your peak usage is what determines cost, as opposed to overall usage, which is more like a residential environment. So I've seen a lot in this sort of industry trade press in the category about microgrids and deployments that are much smaller than they might otherwise be. And I think you've started to see them in some locations where they suddenly decide to, build shade over a parking lot, right? Which of course it's not shade. They're building deployments on top of parking lots and things like that. So do you see a big movement from that perspective? Because then you can simultaneously locate yourself near a commercial user who's just going to lop off the peak air conditioning or the peak refrigeration or the peak load that they need for a data center. And because they don't have transmission loss, if the peak occurs at the same time of day as the brightest sun, even the battery element might not need to be as great. So, I think that's a really interesting dynamic that, again, from an educational perspective, even the landowners of these gigantic warehouses or even the data center providers may not realize.
Yeah, I mean, a couple thoughts. The biggest issue driving the industry today is not about the price, believe it or not. If Microsoft had to decide between 2.5 or 3.5 cents, they're completely price insensitive. They need to build out these data centers. So the issue is more availability, and the reason why people are building microgrids is for I think the last 20 years there was an assumption in the United States and a lot of the developed world that we don't need a lot more energy. We will go flat and we'll just conserve. That's completely gone out the window now with AI and advanced manufacturing and other things. So our growth rate's now 4 or 5% a year, where it was basically zero for a long time. So the availability now is actually, the issue is availability. It's how do I get access to energy? When we looked for this building in the factory, the number one factor for looking for it was, does it have power? Because if it didn't have it, you can't get it within many, many, many years. It's impossible. I think the same is true with data centers. So the reason why a lot of these microgrids are going in is it's not really cost. It's actually, can I get power at all? So that's why they're deploying it, because they can do it a little faster. I'd say the second thing is because a lot of our customers are selling wholesale power, not retail. The irony is in the middle of the day, there's so much of an abundance of solar and solar energy that the wholesale price sometimes in the middle of the day is near zero. So the reason why batteries are important is that when people start firing up their air conditioners in the evening, you don't want it in the middle of the day. You want it like between 5 and 9 o'clock. So batteries are actually really economical, because instead of like turning up a coal plant for a few hours or gas plant for a few hours, batteries are actually a better fit. And one of the things that's happening is, as you see more and more batteries and you have fewer and fewer capacity at the coal plants or natural gas, they're actually going to go out of business, because if they're not above 50% utilization, they're uneconomical. So what's happening is there's a death spiral happening in the fossil fuel industry, where basically as batteries start crowding it out, you will just use batteries and solar and you will shut down all the fossil fuel plants. I suspect this will happen before 2040, if not sooner. Probably not what most people are telling you, they're going drill, baby, drill, but the fossil fuel industry is on it's kind of almost on, even though it seems like all right, I make a crazy statement. Fossil fuel industry is on its last legs. We're hitting the point where around the world, people are buying more and more electric cars. If you have an electric car, you don't need gas. There's not much else you can do with oil. You don't use oil for utilities anymore. So oil is starting to decline, and electricity use is going up. And then you just won't need fossil fuels that much anymore. And most of the world, people are shutting down their coal, not because they're environmentalists. It doesn't make any money.
That's a really interesting point. Sometimes there are interdependencies in a business, and so obviously you guys are interdependent with the battery folks, which the perovskite panels may be great because they don't need the rare earth metals. They may, and they have a lot of other benefits with regards to thickness, et cetera. But the battery industry seems to be lagging behind in innovation, and they continue to need rare earth metals, which may be challenging from a pricing perspective, et cetera. Everybody's been predicting that there are going to be huge advances in the world of batteries sometime soon. Just like they're saying that fusion, commercially available fusion, it's like always 5 years away. So do you expect that the batteries will undergo some pretty dramatic improvements and become less lithium reliant, for example? And I've even heard ultra capacitors tossed around as an alternative to traditional batteries.
Well, I mean, first of all, batteries and solar have a lot of parallels in that in the last 10 to 15 years, they both come down in cost by 90%. So there's been huge innovation on both sides. I think we know this both from the cost of our cars. If you have an electric car, I think we also know about it from the size of our iPhone, and our iPhones like last all day. They didn't even 5, 10 years ago. So that's part of there is a lot of innovation happening in the battery industry. And I'd say most of it is in the lithium side where you have like lightweight and storage. There are a bunch of new technologies, whether it's sodium or other chemistries, where they're going to last more for weeks or years. I think that is coming on. I think one of the challenges that we have as a society is that the Chinese have greatly both innovated but also subsidized those industries. And if you look at their P&L, they're selling below cost. So I think we've got to decide if companies are doing this in the United States, they'd be sued for monopolistic practices. But because they're coming from China, we go, oh, it's free trade. It's like, it's not free trade any more than when Standard Oil was selling below cost to drive their competitors out of business. It's monopolistic. So I think we need to decide as a society. I think there is a bipartisan consensus, but just do we want to have a certain competitor drive everyone out of business and be 100% reliant on them for batteries and energy and pharmaceuticals and other things? Or are we going to put up tariffs to do against us? I'm not a big fan of tariffs unless people cheat. And in these cases, it's pretty obvious and deliberate. And I think what I would say is, do we need to make our own shoes in the United States? Probably not. Do we need energy and pharmaceutical and defense products? Probably. So today, China makes 95% of the world batteries and solar. Part of what I'm trying to do is take it back to the United States so that we have some indigenous capability by leapfrogging. And but it's challenging when you're dealing with irrational competitors. But I would say, fortunately, I think we've made a decision as a society that we want to own some of these things. We don't want to replicate what Europe did, where they were buying all their gas from a guy named Vladimir, because he's a nice guy. He'll always be reliable and keep supplying them. And I think we know how that worked out.
Yeah, for sure. So I'd like to switch gears to the role of trade associations in communications that benefit the entire market, right? And obviously, solar has the potential to sway public opinion if, as an industry, they do the best possible job in sort of consumer level and B2B level PR. But then, of course, there's the lobbying and regulation / legislation side of things. Do you feel like that's an area where your industry needs to improve and really do a better job?
Well, I'll give a plug. We have a couple of trade associations. One is the Solar Energy Manufacturers Association. They've been absolutely fantastic, and they're small and well connected and bipartisan. And they've done a fabulous job for them, both in terms of lobbying, but also in terms of being a resource for us. There's also a one called the Solar Energy Industry Association. I actually worked for them in business school. That was my summer internship. So I like to say that I'm not new to solar. It just took me a few decades to get back into it. I think some organizations like that are challenged because they represent both manufacturers and the developers. And in some cases, developers want cheap Chinese panels, and the manufacturers don't. So there's a little bit of tension there. So I think there's an interesting tension with some trade organizations where if you get too broad, you can't really serve anyone particularly well. And I think they're a great organization, but they are struggling a little bit with that tension. But I think they're certainly an important part of the marketing mix because they are experts. They help get the message out in an aggregated way, and we do a lot of work with them.
Cool. Yeah, they're actually also another source of data that sometimes will end up being a tiebreaker when it comes to both SEO and LLM-based visibility, right? Because when either one of those algorithms goes and looks and makes decisions, it compiles all the information it can crawl. And obviously, trade associations and trade publications are a big source of that data.
Yeah.
So what,
And
what
my also experience from working at one of those trade associations is that you think that everyone in Congress, they know everything, but they know everything like a mile wide and an inch deep. So while lobbying has a bad name, I think there's an important role for some of these trade associations just to be subject matter experts in a good way, just to provide information and education. Now, some of it can be twisted, of course, but I did see firsthand how if you're in Congress, if you're not an expert, you do rely on trade associations to provide you some information and facts to help you just understand how to legislate properly. So I think they do play an important role.
For sure. So for other marketers who may be watching or listening to this, who have a similar, very concentrated audience of buyers or high-end buyers, what should they be doing that they're not doing, that you perhaps seeing, in other industries or just within your own industry?
Stop hiding behind your computer and data. Get out in the world, meet people. And you can meet people virtually like this over video. I think it's funny we say, I want to meet you face to face. And I like, Kevin, this is literally the definition of face to face. I like to say there's face to face and then there's in person. And there are different kind of meetings. In person is more getting to know someone. They're, not having the half-hour transactional meeting, which I would argue video conferencing is great for. Get out and meet people and get to know them on a personal level. Don't just share facts, because people, you brought it up in the beginning, it's a great point. It's not just about providing information. It's about, do I trust you? And part of trust is getting to know someone. So I think that's an important part of marketing. And then I think the second thing is come up with content that is compelling for people to actually read. Most of the content is just, as they call AI slop, or it's lazy, or it's so self-oriented that people go, I don't believe this stuff. It's bullshit. So I like the 7 myths of solar presentation I came up with doesn't specifically help me or my company, but it helps provide thought leadership, or like, here are some counter to conventional wisdom that is both informative and maybe even uplifting to people in a world where so much of what we consume these days is kind of depressing. So I think provide content that is, and it's so much harder to provide original content that is interesting. But I think I see most marketers just, they focus on volume and checking the boxes. And the reality is, if you looked at, and I did this at my last company, I was running this huge group at Logitech, and I was like, what are people actually reading? And the answer is, nobody's reading our stuff. They don't care. So like, why are we spending all this time creating all this content that nobody cares about? And I think if most marketers are honest, most of their stuff sucks. Just stop doing it. Nobody cares. Do things that matter. And it's a lot harder, but it'll stand out.
Well, that's great advice, Scott. Thanks so much for sharing it and everything we discussed today. And I look forward to watching you guys deploy the new factory, because it's super exciting.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about solar and perovskites and marketing. Fun conversation.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.